Hello, everyone. Happy Black History Month and welcome to the Crystal Quarter Dialogues. As always, we invite you as you're watching to put your name, your district, whatever you like in the chat. Today, I am excited to be joined with a good friend of mine, one of my sisters. I've seen this person grow from an undergrad student trying to figure out how to get through the Dominican Republic to now an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. Dr. Christina Cecilia Davidson. Welcome to the Christian Quarter Dialogues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, it's fun saying doctor. I saw the defense. So I really did see it happen. But Dr. Davidson has brought today this amazing book, The Dominican Crossroads, that tells us about HCC Astwood and the moral politics of race making in the age of emancipation. Now, in the AME Church, HCC Astwood is honestly, I remember hearing about him as a little footnote in learning about the Dominican Republic and how the AME Church made it to the Dominican Republic, or rather, how the AME Church, the Dominican Republic, made it back. But Dr. Davidson has created a book-length manuscript that tells us about this man's life and not only its importance to the AME Church, but also how we can see more about the Reconstruction, Black politics, and Black life in the 19th century. So it is a phenomenal work, and we're going to dig into it because there are things here that I did not know. This guy right here, the Dominicans would call him a tigre. He was very interesting, and he definitely is more than a footnote in history. But first, Dr. Davidson, let's talk about you. So I've known you for a while. What is it? Well, I can say how long I've known you. 20, is it 20?
Almost 20 years.
20 years. But you come from a long line of people in the AMU Church. So tell us about the AMU Church and your own faith journey and what the AMU Church means to you.
Well, I would say the AME Church is very foundational to who I am and also an inspiration around what I do as a historian and as a researcher. I became aware of the AME Church as a very young age. I attended Bethel AME in Evanston, Illinois, and really found a foundation of faith in that community, and was there up until high school and through high school, then going into college. And really, it was through the AME Church that I came to know God and came to know faith. But it was also that I came to know community and Christian community and Black history, right? And so really feeling, I really feel that the AME Church gave me my foundation for understanding who I am in this world and being a child of God. And so I also think that the AME Church was critical for me studying the Dominican Republic, because when I decided to do study abroad and go to the Dominican Republic, it really was the AME Church that embraced me in that country. And it was through contacting Bishop Guidry at the time, who then connected me with local AME members, that I found family in a country, a new country for me. And that was way back in 2007, so a while ago.
Wow, yeah, it's going. Wow, yeah, it's been a minute. But one of the things that I've always admired about your faith journey is that, if I could use the word, I would say it's been bold, because you've never been afraid to chart different paths and find different places for your faith. And there have been times when these places have, I know we've talked about, like, well, can you find an AME Church that fits you? Can you find somewhere where you feel nourished? And it's not just about the roots that the church gave you, but about the church today. And I know that when you were in grad school, you were able to be part of an AME faith community in Boston, and I actually got to see some of that there. So tell us about this journey, because I think it's important people understand that our faith evolves and our journey with the church evolves. And sometimes that journey can take us. Following God doesn't necessarily mean staying around or being in a church that made or a denomination. But in your case, you've been able to navigate this in a unique way.
I think for me, because I identify first as a child of God and as a Christian, I've always tried to follow where spirit leads.
Which we
Um,
all should be first Christian and second whatever denomination. That's the first thing. I'm so glad you said that.
yes. And so I think leaving home, you know, when you're, 18 or whatever, um, I had a firm foundation in who I was or in who I am as a Christian. I say was in the past tense because I've obviously developed since then in my faith. And so I was really just trying to go wherever spirit would lead me. And for a while in college, I went to Yale University, and there was a thing called Black Church at Yale. And so I attended that for a little bit. I ended up in a non-denominational evangelical church. And then in graduate school, I went to Duke University and stayed with that denomination where I actually met my husband. But around 2016, for various reasons, right, we left. And gratefully, I ended up in Boston for a postdoc, and that's where I was able to reconnect with the AME Church. Now, all this time, I didn't think of myself as not AME. I especially because I had my connections back home in Evanston and also in the Dominican Republic. And ever since, 2007, when I was going down there, I've been maintaining connections with brothers and sisters in the Dominican Republic who are part of the church, as well as pastors. And they've really poured into my life. And so, I acknowledge them, and I acknowledge my church community in the first part of this book, in the acknowledgments, because it has been so foundational to who I am and the way that I see the world, and also how I do my research. And so it was in Boston that I was able to reconnect with the AME Church and attend New Roots AME, where Reverend Mariama White Hammond is the pastor. And I really feel grateful for that because I felt uprooted. And just as the church's names, I was able to grow new roots there. And so since then, the pandemic happened, and then I moved out to Los Angeles to start my job at the University of Southern California. And so I'm still looking for a church community out here, but feel grateful for the ways in which different communities have poured into my life, and ultimately for the foundation that I have and the people that I know within the AMA Church.
And I've been here for a lot of that journey, and it's always amazed me, your boldness. So you're, like you said, I'm a Christian first. I'm going to go where my spirit leads me, but you did not forget your foundation. And I think sometimes we think that just because people aren't necessarily in a church, they've left us. And that's not always true. I would always tell you, you never left the church. But I understand sometimes you're in places where what we have to offer may not be what you need in that moment, but the church is bigger than just a building or a congregation putting your name on a roll. And you have served the church well by giving us this book. So let's talk a little bit about becoming a historian. I mean, you are a young Black woman who was at an R1, Research One University, although we don't call them that anymore, doing your thing in history. But, I know you didn't start there. So what led you to study history?
Well, I had a number of influential mentors as an undergraduate. Ultimately, I participated in the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, which is a program that run by the Mellon Foundation that exists to get underrepresented people into academia. And so I was able to get additional mentorship and limited funds, but some funds nonetheless, to do some research over the summer as an undergraduate. And so that really sparked my interest, and then, or at least gave me some tools to work with. And then when I went down to the Dominican Republic and was there for study abroad, not necessarily to do research, I ended up in the church, right, because of my contacts. But then I was really curious, right, because in the United States, all we hear about, as African Americans and in the broader culture is how Dominicans hate Haitians, right? And they deny their Blackness. And so I was very confused, because I was like, if this is the case, then why is there an African Methodist Episcopal Church right, in the Dominican Republic? And also all of these beautiful people that I see that are very proud of being part of the AME Church. And so that didn't quite square with me. And I started looking into the history of how the AME Church got to the DR and to Haiti. And I stumbled upon the history, which is now more recognized, of an early 19th century emigration of Black people out of the United States who were leaving to go to the independent republic or Black nation of Haiti in the 1820s. Now, at that time, Haiti governed the whole island, so what later became the Dominican Republic side, and many people ended up settling in the east, and then later that became part of the Dominican Republic. And so some of the oldest members of our community are legacy from those immigrants from 200 years ago, but newer members are there too, and it represents Catholic converts over the years, and the ways in which Protestantism has grown, not just in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, but across Latin America. And so that really fascinated me, and I think in talking with many people, I think that there's really a space within the AME Church, even though our community is very small on the island and in the Dominican Republic, to combat the racism and the anti-Haitianism that we see and we hear about on the broad scale in the U.S. And I'm not denying that exists. It does exist in a very, very virulent form, but in our communities and with the history of our church, I think we have a different story to tell. And so that's what I wanted that's kind of what has motivated me to continue looking into this.
Wow. I mean, I know one of the things that led us to be so close, is the fact that my academic development was also formed because of the Dominican Republic, because it was in the Dominican Republic that, I had my first sustained experience with talking with Afro-Latinos that motivated me, to go to Spain and then ending up in Peru, and, the rest is history. And I'm in this office. But, I know that we've done a lot of work in helping to highlight the story of Afro-Dominicans from the AME Church. And I remember I was in my first time to the United Nations was with you, when you were sharing a book that the Dominican government paid for you to talk about Black Protestantism in the island, which I was like, they paid you to talk about something that they put the run. It was phenomenal to see that. And also thankful to you for helping us to uplift the bicentennial of the settling from Salmon that happened last year. We were able to send a reporter, Joseph Contreras, who did a wonderful story for the Christian Recorder. We put it on the front page of March last year to honor the Salmonese immigrants who were there. So, I'm glad that even today you've been helping to feed into how this works. But I know that every academic book has a start. And, sometimes it's dissertation, sometimes it's research. And I know you've dealt with a lot of things in your research, a lot of writings in your work. So what led you to write this book?
So I wrote my dissertation on the AME Church and its 19th century, mostly its late 19th century development in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And when I get to the defense, my dissertation committee said, well, this is really small, you have to make it broader, right? And I was like, okay, well, the way that I could see to do that was to actually talk about Christopher Columbus, right? And we could all go like, nobody wants to talk about Columbus, except that one of the things that I had learned in writing the dissertation about AME missionaries in the DR was that one of the first missionaries was this man named Henry Charles Clifford Astwood, or HCC Astwood, and he had served doubly as a AME missionary in the 1880s and as U.S. consul. And his claim to fame, or really what made him infamous, was that he had attempted to lease the bones or the remains of Christopher Columbus to a U.S. businessman in 1888. And this got him into a lot of trouble. And so if you talk to Dominican historians, he's known in a footnote in Dominican history for that incident, not for being a missionary, right, as we would know him, but for actually trying to do this thing, right, this scheme of leasing Columbus. And so I thought, well, what a great way to kind of broaden the book and to connect our story to something larger is to look into this case. And so I write a chapter of that in this book. It's chapter 6, and it really covers that episode. And that was the first chapter that I wrote for the book. And then I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to say a lot more about who this person is and what the context of the DR is, and why are there Black U.S. consuls in the Dominican Republic in the 19th century? Like, most people don't know about this stuff. They don't know that African Americans were sent, as diplomats abroad, right? During Reconstruction, right? But they were. And so I have to talk about that. And I have to talk about all of the connections here between Latin America and the Caribbean, the British Caribbean, and the United States and Haiti, and how does this all work? And what I ultimately wanted to do with writing the book about Astwood was to not write a biography, but to talk about a broader question. And that broader question is, how did Black people, or how do we think about Black civic capacity at this time? What is the fight? What is the stakes of the fight here for people? And really what it came down to was, how are people using morality or claims to morality as claims to power to really gain, power for themselves as Black people, or in the opposition, deny power to Black people.
And that power piece got me, as a political scientist and studying race and politics, and thinking about use this man, HCC Astwood. This is around, he's around during the Reconstruction, and then immediately afterwards, when we still, and to see that, the Reconstruction wasn't immediate cutting off of Black power. You still had, drips and drabs, even though Black electoral officials disappeared, Republican governments, and heck, even Democratic governments still made nominations of Black people to certain appointments well into the 20th century, up until, the person that my master's school was formerly named for, Woodrow Wilson. So, and I guess, and just to tell us, like, Astwood was born in the Turks and Caicos, right? He then moved to, walk us through just a little bit of the narrative of his biography.
Yes. So my book begins, it actually begins before his birth. And I talk about Turks and Caicos history, and I do that in order to talk about slavery and to talk about Caribbean slavery, and connected, of course, to U.S. slavery. This is a system, obviously, that existed in the Atlantic world and across the Americas. And so I want people to feel the harshness and just how dehumanizing this system was. And Astwood is born in 1844. That's a significant date because it's 10 years after British abolition. And so he's born free, but it's only 10 years, it's only a decade, right? And all those, the older people around him remember this time, and really not a lot has changed for folks in the British Caribbean after abolition. The Black folks are still on the bottom. And he's born in to what I believe was a white father, a Black mother, right? And so there's this kind of mixed race colored class in Turks and Caicos, and he doesn't have to work like his ancestors on his mother's side did, right? As enslaved people did. He does get some education in the schools, and he kind of works for his father's merchant. His father's a merchant. And that, I think that's really significant. And then 1844 is also a significant date because that is the year in which the Dominican Republic claims independence from Haiti. And so formally I said Haiti governed the whole island. That lasted for 22 years, from 1822 to 1844. And so he's born like at a year of fissure, right? when the DR claims his independence. And so he really comes of age just as the Dominican nation is coming of age. And Turks and Caicos is right on it's an island that's very much connected. Its history is very much connected to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, because enslaved people, where they fled to, right, from the islands would be to independent Haiti, right, when they were leaving. And so, even after emancipation, people would constantly migrate to the northern coast of Hispaniola, Haiti, Dominican Republic, to set up shop. And his early life reflects this. So he eventually goes to the Dominican Republic, and he lives there for a while. And this is actually after the DR has a very complicated history. It basically gets annexed by Spain in 1861, and then ends up in a war with Spain to reclaim its independence, which the Dominicans win in 1865. And so right after they get their independence back, Astwood goes there. But now there's the question of the Americans. Will the Americans come in, right? The United States has also ended its Civil War in 1865 and is now looking to acquire more territory. And so there's a question of whether the United States now will annex the Dominican Republic. And Astwood is in the middle of all of these debates. And so we find him in Puerto Plata. In the 1860s, he goes to Samaná and meets up with descendants of African Americans there in the 1870s, and then he migrates to New Orleans right in the middle of Reconstruction in 1874, and that's really where he gets his chops as a pastor. He gets ordained in the AME Church. He also becomes a orator for the Republican Party and lobbyer. Like he lobbies and he goes on speaking tours, and he gets in good with PBS Pinchback, one of the Republican operatives in New Orleans, and he kind of learns, a lot of crony politics, right? And this then he takes with him in 1882 when he is named U.S. Consul to Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And so he ends up back in the Dominican Republic, but this time in the capital. And that's kind of where the rest of the book starts. So I just talked about 2 chapters, but the rest of the book then looks at his consular career.
And what's interesting to me is like you dropped names, like for example, when I looked at the acknowledgments, I looked at the book, I was like, this guy, like the map that you have that shows the journey of his life. Now, he went to the DR, Puerto Plata, which those of us who know the Dominican know that for many years that was like a major northern port. Then he goes to New Orleans, and I didn't realize that he was at St. James, New Orleans. Like you mentioned, like, he was there. And he was ordained by TMD Ward, who, was one of our famous Reconstruction bishops. And then he got to know PBS Pinchback. This is like my Black History book. This guy was here for all these moments. And then I
was just going to say, a shout out to St. James in New Orleans, and thanks to Reverend Otto Duncan and other folks who really helped me to kind of piece together the St. James piece of this. So yeah.
And I'm glad, I spoke with Reverend Duncan actually at the 8th District planning meeting. So, and I'm glad to see he's doing well. But just seeing like this story has been all around us, but it's like how Astwood is in all these places. And when he gets to the DR, eventually when he leaves, who's the person that's over him? John Mercer Langston. I was like, what? I mean, who was Langston Hughes's uncle and the namesake for Langston University and a Black congressman. This is like all this stuff coming around, and this man who I only knew as a footnote about the DR is in all of this. So let's take it a little bit more to Astwood. And how do we place Astwood into our understanding of the AMU Church in the 19th century?
Hmm. Well, the AME Church in the 19th century, after I would say after the Civil War, is exploding, right? It's growing very, very rapidly. It was, prior to the Civil War, the institution um, that a lot of people in the North would go to, that formed community. And after the Civil War, right, it's growing across the South. And so um, Dr. Dennis Dickerson talks a lot about this in his history of the AME Church, right? It's not just growing in the South, it's also trying to expand to the Caribbean. And then eventually in the 1890s, it's making a really big push to the continent of Africa. And so Astwood is part of this expansion because when he gets named as council, AME bishops are very excited because he's also already ordained in the AME Church. And so they task him with trying to revive the AME connection in the capital of, the Dominican Republic. Now, there had already been people, right, African Americans who had emigrated to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Well, it was Haiti at the time, right? But their descendants are already living in what becomes the Dominican Republic. And so Astwood meets up with these folks. Now, these folks have maintained their religion for 60 some years, and without the help of the connection. And there's various reasons why that makes a lot of sense. I mean, slavery was still intact. It was very, very difficult and hard for people to travel across space and to maintain, church leadership. It was dangerous, right? People could be captured and sold into slavery. And so there's a lot of reasons why that connection was not able to be maintained. And so people are really excited when Astwood arrives. They think, like, finally, we're going to be able to make connections with the people who our forefathers come from, right? African Americans in the United States, the AME Church. And so it's not just a story of AME expansion, it's also a story of legacy, of one of diaspora, of how, and family, how people really kind of see each other across space and still feel like they belong because of this religious connection. Now that gets complicated, of course, because Astwood doesn't do what he says he's going to do ultimately. He doesn't always stay on the straight and narrow, as one would say, but he does make a lot of good faith efforts in the start, and he does revive the church and helps to get the community funding and support from the government, the Dominican government, a very Catholic institution, or at least aligned with the Catholic Church. He's able to get them funding and kind of work his networks, and people are able to make repairs to their church building, actually build a new chapel, and it seems like things are going swimmingly for a while, but things are going really well. And the AME Church does grow. It's still quite small. We're talking under, around 100 people in Santo Domingo, but that's a real presence in a city that's not really that large. If anyone has ever traveled to the capital, we're talking Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, we're talking about the colonial zone, right? This is right in the smack dab of that. It's a pretty small radius.
So, go on.
No, I think the question originally was, how do we understand him in the history of the church? And so my point is simply, like, at this time in history, at the end of the last few decades of the 19th century, we often talk about the AME Church as expanding rapidly, becoming a more global institution. And he is part of that story, but he's also part of a different kind of diaspora of African American immigrants reconnecting with African Americans in the United States. And so we can think about it that way. And we can also think about tensions in his story of imperialism, right? How do we think about missionaries? How do we think about U.S. empire as it's growing in these decades leading up to 1898, right? and how it functions, and he becomes a real symbol of U.S. empire in Santo Domingo, and religion is part of that. And so AMEs, that story is one that we don't often like to talk about, but it's important to talk about. And so he becomes the face of that in Santo Domingo.
Exactly, because it's interesting, and when we look at, the and I'm glad that you hit on the missionary piece, because in this time period, we hadn't yet gone that we had talked about West Africa, but we had not at this time received Reverend McCone in the Ethiopian church. And this gives us a window into what we were thinking about areas outside of the United States. And mission work was still, we still considered the South, quite frankly, as mission work. And, this idea of him and who he reached out to, he specifically was looking to reach to the AMEs that were there, but Astwood really didn't engage in religious work with the Catholic Dominicans. At least it didn't seem. It was more like, or help me out with this one.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's 100% true, because I think that there was a natural community for him to serve, and that was the descendants of African Americans who are living in the city. Now, these people were Dominicans. They claimed they were Dominicans by birth, and many of them spoke Spanish, sometimes better than English, because they were now 1 to 2 generations removed, right, from the people who first landed there. And there were also, I wouldn't say converts in Santo Domingo City, but certainly in Samaná, I've seen evidence of some, and some in Puerto Plata. And so what's interesting is it's not like there was this big mass push towards converting the Catholic nation, but you have this growing church in only a few blocks away from the seat of the archdiocese, the Catholic archdiocese, with a Spanish-speaking congregation, with people who are Black and ordained in the AME church. And in fact, Bishop Campbell, I believe it is, comes down and ordains some Dominicans. And you have the very same leaders who are Spanish-speaking AMEs connected to multiple associations. We would think of them as fraternities within the city of Santo Domingo, and connected to these fraternities and to people by blood relations, through fraternal relations, through social relations. And I believe that there was influence there. It wasn't that these people were converting per se, it's that the Catholic Church around them, the priests and everybody, felt a little bit nervous because there's the potential for conversion, right? These people are highly connected, and this church is becoming more and more integrated. And that's the argument that I make in chapter 5. Right in the 1880s, then, the Catholic Church actually puts out a number of articles in its official organ denouncing Protestantism. And I argue that these things are coinciding with the growth of the AME Church right around 1886, 1887, and 1888. And the arguments are they're quite ferocious, as a kind of top-down, notice to everybody, those who are reading, and also really the priests, that we are a Catholic people. And John, I'll just say one other thing, since we're touching on fraternities. It's not just the AME Church that Astwood starts in Santo Domingo. It's also the Odd Fellows, the Grand United Order of the Odd Fellows. And the Odd Fellows is a Black fraternity, at least this branch of it, that he begins and he brings to the DR. And he, I think this is significant because when they when they kind of inaugurate their chapter, they do so in a Catholic church, and they're blessed by a Catholic priest. So I think that this is really significant because it's showing some of these crossovers and connections between people who identify as Catholic and people who identify as Protestant, and it's not so much of a strict divide that we think of, right? These communities are actually quite integrated within the city and within the city's culture.
You know, and what's interesting to me, like I just learned had to pause and rethink something that you just said regarding the insularity of the Dominican church. Like in this time, like you were saying, there were converts. The Dominican church was viewed as a vibrant, growing concern. The church that you and I met when we were doing our work in the Dominican Republic was something that had become, you know, a little bit more insular and a little bit more isolated almost. Like it was viewed as this cultural anachronism or cultural identity of the Samana people. And understanding that in this era, the face of Protestantism in the Dominican Republic is the AME Church. That's powerful and also sobering to think that nowadays that definitely is not the case. And I'm sure that's another dialogue about how that happened and Pentecostalism. But this just thinking like you're showing like, no, the AMEs were the Protestants. That's revolutionary.
That's true. That is true. And it's very true in Santo Domingo, the capital, less so in other regions of the island. So if we're actually thinking about Samana in this time period, we're thinking about British Wesleyans, but of course made up primarily of people who originally identified as African Americans and their descendants. I mean, African Methodists and then their descendants. And this is also modeled in Puerto Plata. And it's actually quite interesting because one of the missionaries who comes to Santo Domingo, his name is Adolphus Meves. He is Haitian. He actually studies at Wilberforce for 4 years, goes back to the island, and then gets appointed to Santo Domingo. And he makes the argument that at this time, you know, the Dominican Republic and Santo Domingo in particular, it seems like a backwater. You know, it's nothing compared to Port-au-Prince, right, where we have multiple kinds of denominations, right? In Port-au-Prince, there's the Wesleyans, there's the AMEs, and there's also the Episcopal Church, there's the Baptists, and so there's this whole kind of Protestant community in Haiti, right? But not so much so in the capital of the Dominican Republic. And so he's really arguing that the AME Church has an opening here, a place to really make an investment and really become the leading church, right, in Santo Domingo, if only it would, you know, get some investment. And that's always the thing, right, with all of the missions abroad is, you know, the need for more money, and a lot of reasons, of course, why our church was not in a position to do that, coming out of slavery and Reconstruction.
And even to this day, you know, we have to remind people that, you know, we are a church descended from those who were enslaved. The endowments that we are supposed to have, well, you can drive by some of the United Methodist churches and see the endowments that we helped build. But that's another story for the time. But we've done well with what we've had. Now, I wanted to like press with you a little bit because in your book, my favorite chapter was I think I told you was chapter 5, the one where we have the correspondence between, that was in 5, the one where Jacob James, or was that 6? That was 5. That's
it depends on what you're talking about.
It was Jacob James, and when he wrote the AME, when he wrote the British Wesleyans and said, you might as well not send anybody back down here because the AMEs are taking us back. Was that 5 or 6?
I think that probably is 5.
Yeah, that's my favorite chapter. That was my chapter, because in that chapter, you really, to me, it was like, I mean, I thought I knew the story of how the Dominicans became reincorporated into the AME Church, but you totally gave a recasting on that. So would you mind sharing, you know, this new light and on the details of like how we know how the Dominicans got there, but how did they get back to the AME Church?
So I think what you're talking about with chapter 5 is I talk about in this chapter, and the main argument for this chapter is that these societies that we talked about, the Odd Fellows as well as the AME Church, were organs of cultural transmission in the Dominican Republic. This is a time in Dominican history of vast transformations. And so in the first part of the book, I talk about economic and political transformations. I think that's chapters 3 and 4. And in this part of the book, chapter 5, I'm talking about cultural transformations. I'm not the first historian to do this. I am the first historian to say, hey, the AME Church and the Oddfellows, two Black institutions, were actually part of this as well. And so, we could say that Astwood is the reason why all of this happened. But I try to challenge that. I say that, yes, he might have, given the impetus or at least a pathway for the AME to become, to kind of come on the scene more, to get perhaps money from the Dominican government. But it's really the descendants of people who are there. Now, we know this, right? We know that pastors have a vision often, and he considers himself the pastor. And at one point he says, El Jefe, right? The big boss, right? Of the AME Church, right? But we also know that it really is the congregants, right? Who make up the body, right? And who do the work. And so I argue in this chapter that if we look and we read against the grain of his missionary letters, we can see that, it really is the community, not just church members, but also Catholics, Dominican Catholics, so Dominican Protestants and Dominican Catholics, who kind of come together and say, yes, we do want this church to move forward in our city. And I think that's really significant because of the anti-Blackness that we find at this time in history among the elite in the Dominican Republic, and also this notion that the Dominican Republic was super, super Catholic, and there was, you couldn't be anything else but Catholic if you were Dominican. Well, that's just simply not true. There were people who identified wholly as Dominican and wholly as Protestant at this time period. And I wanted to show the plurality of Dominican society, again, to combat this kind of white nationalism that is couched within Catholic religion. There was a pluralism to Dominican society that people don't recognize, and the AME Church is part of that story. I'm also, perhaps this book is the first one to really recognize the AME Church's existence during this period. And so I think that that's also really important, because other historians who, of course, have had to recognize a Protestant church has not necessarily said African Methodist, they've said Methodist. And that then raises the question of British Wesleyans, which, yes, were present in the northern regions, right, Samana and Puerto Plata, but it was the AME Church that went to the capital. My favorite page was on 169. It was chapter 5. That where they were corresponding with the British Wesleyans. But and then ironically, Astwood is the first person to say maybe we should change the name from Africa to Allen Methodist Episcopal Church. And people said no, we're keeping AME as an African Methodist. And even to this day, you will, as anti-Black as the Dominican Republic can appear to some people, African Methodist Episcopal is something that they will not. Africana is part of the identity of the church, which is fascinating to me. Now, you mentioned reading against the grain, and I know that when you do a book like this, the historiography is more than just there's a method to how you do this. It's not just, hey, I sat in an archive and I found some things. So you have to, there's a method. Every academic discipline has their own methods. So how was this book created? Talk to me about, the research practices and the methodologies you use, because I'm sure the people here are saying, so did you just lock yourself in the room all day with some old books and write? This took a lot of work and thought and to create in your perspective. So tell us about how you wrote this book and the how this was put together. Yeah, I think this is really important to talk about to this community, to the AME Church and to African Methodists, to you folk, right? I think it's so important to talk about because historians rely on papers. We rely on old papers, and it is so often the case that, somebody passes away and they've collected a whole bunch of papers and those papers are thrown out as if they're not important. Well, for somebody who's trained as a historian in my discipline, like, that is throwing away history. Now we can no longer access those voices. And I certainly ran into that, right? A lot of Black history has been thrown away as being unimportant or purposefully destroyed, right? And it's not just our like people like us, right? Not just Black folk that do that, right? Obviously, our stuff wasn't preserved as, you mentioned the United Methodists, for example, right? And so I think the preservation of history is really important. And if people do have old, church papers or like hold on to that stuff, contact a historian, contact me, it's important because that's what allows us to rewrite the history. Now, in the case of the Dominican Republic, there's an additional kind of added layer of difficulty because not only are the stories of a Black church or like Black folks not often talked about, but I went into the Dominican Republic, into the archive saying, oh, I want to work on Protestantism. And, one of the historians there was like, well, we're a Catholic country. You're not going to find any Protestants here, which just simply was not true. But we also work under these assumptions and stereotypes of what, can be found, what the official story is. And so now I'm working against the grain of what everybody says is true, right? And so this required a lot of painstaking work to go and look at old newspapers in the Dominican Republic to try to find mention of Astwood's name. Digital searching also helped when I was stateside. I went into the archive in the DR and looked at, sources regarding Santo Domingo in the 19th century, and that really helped, and Astwood was very litigious, so I was also able to look at a lot of court records. And
it was a tigre.
Yes. It was a tigre, which for those who don't speak Dominican Spanish is just another way of saying a trickster, right? A trickster figure. And so he, so I was able to trace him that way. I was able to look at also U.S. government records, right? Because he was U.S. counsel, so there's foreign service papers. I was able to get at him that way. And then for the early history, like Turks and Caicos Islands, I had to do a lot of treasure hunting. And that was actually during the COVID shutdown. So it was a lot of corresponding with the British Library to get, old church records for Turks and Caicos to see, like, when was he born? Can I locate his birth certificate or at least a record of him in the church? And then newspapers to try to trace his family in them. And I was ultimately successful, thank God. But it was quite difficult. And then we mentioned the British Wesleyans a number of times as the people, the missionaries who were attending to descendants of African-American immigrants in the northern region. They have their papers. And so that's where we get the correspondence between them, and Astwood is very well aware of them because, of course, he spent time in that northern, in Puerto Plata and stuff like that. And so trying to collect all these sources from all different kinds of archives from different places, different newspapers, and combine them to tell a story. That's what I do as a historian, but it's very difficult, especially working in Black history. So keep those papers if you have them.
Yeah, and that's something that we're finding. I know Dr. Tyler, our new historiographer, and I were talking with Aaron Treadwell, who is in excellency. He will soon be an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University. And one of the things he's been trying to do is help churches digitize their archives. I mean, because the running joke in the church is that there's not an AME archives because archives are in people's houses, and the things that as people pass, as this generation, as generations pass, like, those things that grandmama kept, those books, those church documents that you're like, well, why is all this stuff here? There's a gold mines that are literally sitting in people's houses that they just don't know what to do with, or, no one understands or sees. But just hearing, all that you had to go through. Now, you actually had to go to the Turks and Caicos, right? Did you actually go to Turks and Caicos?
I was not able to is when I got to that part of the research, it was during COVID. And
COVID.
so
I was about to tease you and say, oh, I'm so upset that you had to go to Turks and Caicos to go look for something. But I think you and Josh need to go to Turks and Caicos, for something. I mean, I think there should be like a Turks and Caicos Library Festival or something. Y'all can figure that out.
I think that would be amazing. And, and just I wanted to just highlight one thing, John, as you're talking about records. My colleagues, some people that I know, Ryan Mann Hamilton out of CUNY, and Sofia Monegro, who's a PhD student at UT Austin, doing fabulous work, as well as the Dominican Studies Institute Library, have put together an amazing collection that is available online through JSTOR on the Samana community, digitizing their records under the title We Choose Freedom. And so there are people out there doing this work and that recognize that our history, our church history, is important. And so they have gone and digitized the records of the AME Church, as well as St. Peter's, which was the old Wesleyan Church and is now identified with the Dominican Evangelical Church. And so, that's just a start, but there's so much more to do.
Wow. And for those of you who are watching, the link to that JSTOR is in the email that you received this notice from to watch the TCR Dialogue. Well, Dr. Davidson, I enjoy saying that because I was around for this, so I enjoy saying that. It has been an honor to have you here with us. Again, we're here celebrating your book, Dominican Crossroads. It's an academic book, but it definitely, I appreciate the way you write. It's a very conversational way, and I can tell you had fun writing some of this stuff because I can tell you come out with some of these pages and you were just like, I can hear you laughing at some of the stuff. Or I can see you shaking your head. But you're early in your academic career. You are an assistant professor, as am I, and so you're on your road to tenure and other things. So, what's your next research project? What's next for you?
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely did have fun writing this book, and I hope I can find another project that was as enjoyable and as rewarding on a personal level for me. I'm still interested in religion, race, and empire. I mean, those are the themes that I work on. So right now, I'm returning to Wesleyan records from this region and thinking about the transition from white British missionaries to white American missionaries, and the ways in which Americans at the turn of the 20th century were thinking about Latin America as a blank field for missionization. And obviously, because of this story, right, we know that that's not true. There were already all kinds. There were the British Wesleyans, there were the African Methodists, at least in the Caribbean, when we think about Haiti and Dominican Republic. And so I'm interested in telling a story and studying what I see as an era of spiritual warfare. And I name it that because this is also the era of Pan-Americanism and U.S. occupations in various countries in Latin America, principally the Caribbean, and we can think about, Central America, we can think about Panama, Haiti, Dominican Republic, all undergo very, very brutal U.S. occupations. And so I think that I want to talk about U.S. ecumenicists, people who believed in, joining together to spread the word, but the word, according to them, was, coming from a certain kind of Christianity, one that was led by white people, and was trying to expand American empire to the region, and then juxtaposition that with much of the Black internationalism and also Latin American counter movements that were taking place on a spiritual level. And so when we talk about this time, we often talk about race, and we'll talk about migration, and we talk about empire. I want to talk about religion and spiritual warfare to kind of recharacterize this moment as a moment of not just U.S. empire and Black migration, but one of spiritual warfare, if we think about it from a spiritual sense of what people were actually thinking when they were walking within a religious sphere.
Wow. That's interesting. And it makes me immediately think of my work with the World Methodist Council. There was an academic volume that was done a few years ago about Methodism. And one of the chapters looked at how World Methodist Council sessions became places where African Americans as well as Africans contested ideals of race and empire. And this reflecting on, what Methodism looked like in the Caribbean, how there wasn't an independent Black Methodist church aside from AME and AME Zion until, much later on, and just thinking about what you'll find, because I do know what already exists, like how we used, the AME church used international spheres to talk about in religious ways how empire was wrong. So this is fascinating. I can't wait to see what you come up with next. But
thank you. I'd love to talk to you more about it, John.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm gonna be here. I'm not going anywhere. So anyway, again, this is Dominican Crossroads by Christina Cecilia Davidson. This is printed by Duke University Press. And I encourage everyone, if you are interested in understanding about, the amateurs of the Dominican Republic, if you're interested in learning more about this very just intriguing man from the Reconstruction era, if you want to just see, how certain ideas of race, politics, and religion evolve, I encourage you to take a read of this book. You will not be sorry. And for those of you who are watching who have students to assign stuff to, make your students buy the book. And this should be in someone's board of examiners to help them with AME history. I know what I'm talking about. So, Dr. Davidson, thank you for being here with us. Any final words before we close?
Just thank you, Dr. Thomas. I really, really, really appreciate the opportunity to share my work with you all, and thank you, to the broader church community for helping me get to where I am. I really feel like I couldn't have done it without you all and without the grace of God. So, thank you.
Amen. And that's a good place to end. So, everyone, I hope you're enjoying Black History Month. Remember, Black History Month is a month highlight of 365 or 66 days where we always celebrate our story. So look forward to seeing you all next time on the Krista Recorder Dialogues.